What's up everyone, Landon with Late Model Restoration. One of the age-old questions surrounding the Fox platform is how do I install a K-member? Well, I think it's about time I show everyone a general understanding on how you go about installing a K-member into your Fox Body Mustang. In the aftermarket world, K-members offer several important benefits for your Mustang, such as their lightweight characteristics, which provide serious weight savings. The majority of all high-end K-members will share similar features as well, such as high-quality materials, a bolt-in design, and they're even going to offer several different versions for popular engine swaps. K-members are usually sold in complete kits that include the K-member itself, tubular lower control arms, coil-over hardware with multiple spring rate options, and installation hardware. Oftentimes, the only additional parts required for these kits are front struts that are compatible with the provided coil-over hardware. Here at LMR.com, we make it very clear on the product page what the K-member kit will need in addition to what it comes with. From caster camber plates, offset rack bushings, a bump steer kit, and even ball joint spacers for the kits that include Fox style ball joints for any of you guys running a 94 to 04 SN95 spindle. For this install, I am going to be using a Team Z K-member, a set of our SVE caster camber plates, and a pair of strange 10-way adjustable front struts. Later on down the road, this car will be getting an aftermarket bump steer kit, which is also something to consider when swapping to an aftermarket tubular K-member. I've already removed the factory components from the car, and if you would like to see my detailed removal process, be sure and check out the video in the description. When installing aftermarket K-members, there may be a few factory components that will need to be rerouted or modified. In my case, the only thing I had to do was tweak the fuel lines to clear the K-member, grind down the locating dowel on the passenger side motor mount, and pull out on the steering column about an inch to reconnect the steering shaft to the steering rack. Installing an aftermarket K-member can be managed by yourself, but it is in your best interest to have a friend help you out so they can hold and lift certain components. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get started. Before you get things rolling, go ahead and disconnect your negative battery cable. With the factory K-member and its associated components out of the way, check to see if your new K-member has provisions for the factory locating tabs on the motor mounts. In my case, the driver's side mount was right on the money. However, the passenger side tab needed to be removed. Grind the tab off and then paint the exposed bare metal with the rust preventative paint. Prep the K-member hardware and make sure that there is a washer on each bolt. Have a friend help you hold the K-member and begin threading the two front bolts on each side. Now, install the two rear bolts on each side. Fully tighten the hardware. Reinstall the two motor mount nuts and fully tighten. Remove the balancer or oil pan support if it was used. Apply a thin film of polyurethane bushing grease to the outside of the control arms if applicable. Position the control arm into place. Slide the provided bolts through the K-member and arm in the same orientation as the factory hardware. Thread on the nuts and then loosely tighten. Go ahead and do the same for the other control arm. Now you can go ahead and disassemble your engine support bar. Lay out the strut and coil-over hardware on a workbench. For this particular application, the components will be installed in the following order: strut, threaded sleeve, lock collar, lower spring collar, the spring itself, the top spring mount, the thin bearing race, the bearing assembly, then another thin bearing race, the thrust cone, and then one of the 15mm spacers from the SVE caster camber plate kit. Do the same for the other strut and coil-over hardware. Lay out the caster camber plate parts on a workbench. The only two pieces that will be size specific are the upper plates. The single mounting hole that is furthest from the center bearing plate opening will be installed on the passenger side. The single mounting hole that is closest to the center bearing plate opening will be installed on the driver's side. Also, the long, slanted, tapered edge on each of the upper plates will be closest to the fender. The lower plates and bearing plates are not size specific. The larger offset on the bearing plate will be positioned underneath the upper plate and be positioned in a way that it faces the larger offset on the upper plate. Before installing the plates, place the small washers over the provided Allen head cap screw. Position the upper plate over the bearing plate in its correct orientation. Install the cap screws into the outermost holes in the bearing plate. There'll be 2 of these per side. Make note of the provided spacers. The 6 spacers with the smaller inner diameter will properly space the upper plate between the strut tower. Next, position the upper plate, followed by 3 washers over each stud, and then finger tighten the 3 provided nuts. Before installing the coilover assembly, be sure and adjust your Strange 10-way adjustable struts. I set ours halfway, and of course further adjustments can be made when you're at the track. Position the strut through the bearing plate, install one of the 8mm spacers from the SVE caster camber plate kit, and then loosely tighten the factory 21mm retaining nut. Repeat these steps for the other side. If you would like, take this time to clean up your factory spindle and re-grease the ball joint opening. Remove the cotter pin and castle nut from your new ball joint. Place the spindle over the ball joint. Reposition the spindle into the strut and reinstall the factory strut to spindle retaining bolts. Loosely thread the castle nut and strut to spindle retaining nuts. You'll want to torque the castle nut to 129 pound-feet and then reinstall your cotter pin. Torque the strut to spindle retaining nuts to 148 pound-feet. Re-grease the spindle shaft if you took the time to clean your spindle. Reinstall the brake rotor, outer bearing, followed by the washer. Go ahead and thread on the spindle retaining nut. Retighten the nut, reposition the nut retainer, and then reinstall the cotter pin. Now you can lightly tap the dust cap to properly seat it back into the rotor. Cut the brake caliper tie and position it back onto the rotor. Re-grease the slide pins if needed, and then reinstall them back into the caliper and then tighten them down. To properly set spring preload, run the spring collar all the way until the spring has 0 up and down movement. Run up the lock collar, but do not tighten. Use a spanner wrench to turn the spring collar up until a distance of 5mm is achieved between the 2 collars. Run up the lock collar and then tighten the 2 collars together. Jack up on the control arm to establish some suspension preload. Once preload is achieved, tighten down the control arm hardware. Go ahead and repeat these steps for the other side. If the rear steering rack bushing stayed on the factory K-member, slide them off and reinstall them back into the steering rack. Install the steering rack onto your new K-member. The factory hardware will not work. Of course, this is going to be K-member dependent, so I had to source 2 new bolts, 2 new nuts, and 4 new washers. This will vary depending on the K-member you're installing. Install the hardware in the same orientation as the factory and tighten down the nuts. Reinstall the outer tie rods into the spindle and torque the nuts to 23 to 32 pound-feet. Take this time to grease the new ball joints, if applicable. Since I reused factory-style rack bushings, our steering shaft was approximately 1 inch too short from reconnecting to the rack itself. I simply pulled out on the steering column to address the short length and then reinstalled the steering shaft retaining hardware. Then, make sure all of the wiring harnesses are nicely secured and away from any moving or potentially hot parts. Go ahead and get the car on the ground and check the front ride height. More than likely, your coilover setup will need some fine tuning. Jack up the car again and remove the wheels. Thread the lock collar away from the spring collar. Place a mark on the spring collar and begin turning the collar up to raise the vehicle. Do this until proper ride height is achieved. Retighten the lock collar and reinstall the wheels. Set the caster camber plates in a way that the studs on the bottom plate are centered in the upper plate openings. Torque the upper plate nuts to 65 pound-feet and the Allen head cap screws to 32 pound-feet. Be sure you fully tighten your strut shaft retaining nut. Reinstall the serpentine drive belt and reconnect the negative battery cable. Be sure and run the car down to your local alignment shop if you plan on driving the car on the street. That will complete the steps needed to install a K-member into your Fox Body Mustang.
Now, as far as installation time is concerned, I would honestly set aside an afternoon to get this one done. There really isn't a set time because skill level is going to vary from person to person. By now, you're probably wondering what all the factory components weigh. The factory K-member, control arms, struts, springs, and caster camber plates weighed in at a very heavy 131.5 pounds. Now, the Team Z K-member, control arms, strange front struts, their coilover hardware, and the SVE caster camber plates tip the scale at 66.5 pounds. Do the math on that, and that's 65 pound saving, which is well over 50%. That's going to wrap things up on our K-member install into the 88 Coupe. Be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel to see more videos like this one.
All of these components that I used are currently available from the real Fox Body enthusiasts, lmr.com.